What if the first configuration was never built, but found? Imagine a box older than Lemurchand, older than every documented pact, older even than the first whisper of Leviathan in human history accrued. Asymmetrical cube discovered not in the hands of an artisan, but buried deep beneath a monastery that should never have existed. The Vatican's earliest forbidden records describe it as a machine that breathes. A brass artifact with lines that don't meet, sigils that don't align, geometry that looks almost right, but not enough to be safe. They called it the prototype, the first machine, the forgotten device that predates the lament configuration by centuries. And unlike the modern box, which waits for desire, curiosity, or ambition, this one reacts instantly. Priests reported that when they entered the storage chamber, the box pulsed softly at first, like a heartbeat felt through metal, and then more violently, as if responding not to touch but to fear. One monk wrote that when he approached it, the cube rotated a single panel on its own, as though testing him, echoing his trembling breath with a breath of its own. Another wrote that it hummed out with intention but with error, a low broken tone that made the walls quiver. They did not dare solve it, because nothing needed solving. This box activated itself. This box did not open chains or summon Cenobites. It opened echoes, glitches in reality, flashes of an unfinished labyrinth still searching for instructions. And in that moment, the Vatican realized something terrifying. If the modern box is the key to Leviathan's perfect system, then this prototype is the doorway to its unfinished version. A version that should never have survived. A version that was not ready for the world. Now, you are about to see why. The prototype was not a puzzle box. It was not crafted to be solved, admired, or studied. It was a machine, an unfinished piece of divine hardware. An early unstable interface between the human world and Leviathan's system. Its architecture betrays this truth the moment you look closely. Where the modern lament configuration is symmetrical, pristine, mathematically perfect, the prototype is jagged, uneven, almost dissonant. Lines run where they shouldn't. Sigils collide with each other instead of interlocking. Brass panels bulge as though the geometry beneath is struggling to escape. It is the shape of something that has not yet learned how to become itself. The Vatican's earliest archivists described it as a cube made of hesitation, a device that looked like a failed attempt at perfection. But to understand it is to understand Leviathan before Leviathan became a system, before pain became protocol, before Cenobites became modules. The prototype is a relic from a time when Leviathan was still testing the boundaries of the material world, sending out fragments of geometry to learn how flesh and thought respond to divine structure. It was not a gift. It was not a trap. It was a question, and humanity was never meant to answer it. When priests opened the archival chamber, they found the prototype humming at a frequency no human instrument could record, a faint vibration that seemed to rise from the brass itself, not mechanical, but alive. The Vatican first believed it was reacting to ambient temperature or humidity, until one monk realized something far more chilling. The box was syncing itself to the breath of anyone who approached. Inhalation, exhalation, tremor, fear, the geometry inside the machine shifted in time with the living organism scanning it. It was reading them, measuring their contradictions, gathering data the way auditor would centuries later. But the prototype lacked the advanced architecture to understand what it collected. So instead of routing the data into a refined pipeline, it processed it as noise, producing a kind of system echo, broken, stuttering, incomplete. Inside the box, the labyrinthine geometry is not symmetrical, but turbulent. Pull out its interior diagrams. Vatican researchers once did, and you find pathways that twist but end abruptly, corridors that loop back into themselves, sigils half-formed like code written by a programmer who lost consciousness mid-command. One Vatican engineer called it a map of a city not yet built. Another wrote, "This box is a system without rules. It is architecture looking for a purpose." The prototype had no auditor, no surgeon, no whisperer, no scribe. The modules had not yet been created. There was no proper pipeline for correction, no stable execution path for souls. So what happened when the machine opened was neither judgment nor transformation. It was a cascade of glitches, a burst of raw signals struggling to find meaning. The prototype was basically Leviathan's beta test. When activated, the machine does not unfold smoothly like the modern configuration. It jars, it spasms. Parts of it rotate with the grinding sound of metal being forced into shape by a will that does not yet understand physics. Panels shift out of alignment, exposing the inner mechanisms, pulsing strands of brass-like veins, rotating symbols that never finish their rotation, geometric plates that oscillate between two configurations as though undecided. Sometimes the box emits light, not steady, cold Leviathan light, but flickering, unstable illumination like a dying star. And with each flicker, reality bends in uneven waves. Walls ripple, shadows distort, air thickens. It is as if the world is being forced to accommodate a foreign logic that does not yet understand how to inhabit it. This instability is the key to the prototype's danger. The modern box opens a gateway as stable, deliberate conduit designed to interface with Leviathan's perfect labyrinth. But the prototype opens attempts. It reaches toward Leviathan the way a child reaches toward a word it cannot pronounce, producing sound without meaning. The result is unpredictable. One activation recorded by Vatican scribes caused every candle in a cathedral to extinguish at once. Another made the ground vibrate for 3 seconds as though something massive were walking beneath it. A third activation created a corridor that appeared in mid-horizontal, shimmering like a wound cut into the universe, then collapsed before anything could cross. These were not Cenobites emerging. These were errors. The box's internal logic appears to have been patched over countless times. Some sigils seem overwritten, others scratched out as if Leviathan itself tried to correct its earlier attempts and failed. The prototype is filled with contradictions, a divine object built with mortal imperfections, a perfect system speaking in an incomplete language. It is the only object in existence that shows Leviathan learning. And that is why the Vatican feared it more than any demon, because it implied that Leviathan was not always the flawless machine god we see in the labyrinth that it evolved, iterated, tested, and refined itself. That even a cosmic system had a beginning. Its beginning was uncertain. Prototype S architecture proves that the first interface Leviathan attempted to create was not meant to summon Cenobites or administer judgment. It was meant to collect feedback. It was meant to observe how human fear, pain, memory, and contradiction respond to geometry. It was a sensor, a recorder, a probe from the earliest age of the labyrinth, a machine learning how to speak to humanity long before the first contract was signed, long before the first soul was rewritten, long before the labyrinth discovered its perfect, brutal logic. This is what makes the prototype dangerous. Not that it opens a door, but that it opens an unfinished version of a door, one that leads not to the labyrinth we know, but to the chaotic back end of a system still assembling itself. And when that system listens, it listens badly. When it responds violently. When it learns through distortion. This box is not the key to Leviathan. It is the ghost of Leviathan's earliest attempt at communication, an artifact that should never have endured the ages, should never have survived the refinement of the system, and yet somehow did. The prototype speaks a language no human was meant to hear, not the clean, surgical geometry of the modern configuration, but a fractured dialect of shapes attempting to communicate before they fully learned how. To study the prototype is to witness Leviathan's first attempts at articulation. The stuttering vocabulary of a cosmic intelligence, still assembling the syntax of torment, still discovering the grammar of pain. Where the perfected box is a flawless sentence carved in brass, the prototype is a draft full of crossed out lines, unfinished words, symbols that begin but never resolve. The Vatican scholars who dared to analyze it wrote that looking at its surface felt like reading a prayer written by a trembling hand, something reaching for precision, but failing in ways that make it far more terrifying. Human writing collapses when it falters. Divine geometry, when imperfect, becomes alive. It moves. It changes. It searches for coherence with the desperate hunger of a machine god trying to define itself. Every panel on the prototype shows evidence of this early struggle. A curve aims toward symmetry, but tilts by a degree to many, producing a harmonic dissonance that vibrates through the air as a low hum. A sigil starts with the sharp, angular stroke familiar from the completed lament configuration, but dissolves into spirals. As if Leviathan attempted to shape the symbol, but abandoned it mid-creation, these patterns do not simply sit idle, they respond. When breath hits their surface, they quiver. When fear tightens in the chest of whoever holds the box, the sigils ripple like disturbed water. Where modern boxers respond to intent, desire, or will, the prototype responds to the instability inside the human, the anxiety, the contradiction, the unspoken scream beneath the surface. It feeds not on ambition, but on imbalance, because imbalance is the only language it understands. A perfect system speaks to coherence. An unfinished system speaks to chaos. The Vatican's Forbidden Codex Sanguinis records that the prototype's geometry reacts strongest to imperfections in the observer's mind. One monk claimed that when a man with a fractured sense of guilt held it, the sigils rearranged themselves into spiraled knots. Another described how, in the hands of someone full of suppressed rage, the lines sharpened into jagged strokes, as though mirroring the violence inside him. The prototype is a mirror, but not of the face it mirrors the fragments. It reflects the parts of the psyche that do not align. Modern Leviathan geometry punishes contradiction. Prototype seeks contradiction. That is why it is dangerous. It does not require a solution. It searches for one. It tries to adjust its own geometry to match the brokenness of the human examining it, like a machine trying to tune itself with the wrong calibration data. And every attempt produces error. Every error produces pain frequency. Every frequency destabilizes reality a little more. Leviathan's true language is symmetria, language of absolute consistency. But the prototype speaks symmetry's opposite, a language built from near matches, half patterns, corrupted glyphs. The result is a sound Vatican researchers described as sacred static, a crackling whisper of geometry trying to complete itself. When held close to the ear, the box emits faint tones that rise and fall like someone humming a melody they do not yet know. These tones are not random. Theologist engineers noted they follow patterns similar to early algorithmic spirals, repeating and mutating in an attempt to find stability. The prototype is literally thinking, and thinking badly. It is running incomplete code. It is trying to boot an operating system that did not yet exist at the time of its creation. And this is why its geometry is dangerous. Imperfect divine language is not inert. It is volatile. Sometimes the prototype completes a symbol. When this happens, the air thickens, as though the world is holding its breath. For a fraction of a second, the box's geometry aligns perfectly with the logic of the modern labyrinth. If it briefly remembers the language, it will someday speak fluently. Light bends, shadows flatten. A single panel rotates with perfect grace, and then the alignment collapses, like a glitch. When these symbols break apart, they unravel violently. One historian wrote, "It is the sound of the universe biting its tongue." Another said, "It is geometry choking itself." In these moments, the prototype emits small pulses echoes that flicker across rooms. It's creating distortions that Vatican scholars compared to heat haze, mirage, or a ghost taking shape. But these are not ghosts. They are failed instructions. Pain geometry that cannot route to a correct module because none exists yet. The prototype creates the shadow of a corridor, not the corridor itself. The beginning of a chain's materialization, not the chain. The tremor of a Cenobite's presence, not the Cenobite. These incomplete manifestations are terrifying precisely because they are not whole. Nothing is more frightening than a summons that fails halfway. In the labyrinth's fully formed geometry, symbols connect like gears in a perfect machine. But on the prototype, they grind. You can hear brass rubbing against itself, sigils clashing, geometric logic struggling to resolve contradictions. When the box is activated, misaligned patterns shift like tectonic plates under pressure, creating microtremors that ripple outward. Vatican researchers reported books sliding off shelves, glass vibrating, metal groaning as if resonating with a cosmic frequency no mortal structure was built to withstand. These were not hauntings, they were system noise. The language of imperfect geometry even affects perception. When someone stares too long at the prototype surface, their vision begins to distort. Sigils appear to stretch, contract, or drift sideways as though floating free of the brass. This is not hallucination. It is the mind attempting to interpret a symbol that has no meaning yet, like reading a word in a language that exists only partly. Some monks described seeing centuries of failed versions layered atop one another. Others saw shapes trying to remember themselves. One Vatican archivist went blind in one eye after sketching a single misaligned glyph. The sketch itself later curled on the page as though alive. Imperfect geometry is not symbolic, it's infectious. It spreads like a thought virus, destabilizes everything that looks at it. All of this points to one truth. Leviathan's earliest language was not a command, but a stutter. The prototype box is the fossil of that stutter, an artifact of a god machine trying to speak before it learned how. It demonstrates that pain was not always protocol, order was not always perfected, labyrinth was not always a cold, flawless system. There was a time when Leviathan was still assembling itself, experimenting, testing, iterating. And this box is the last surviving specimen of that era, a relic from the age when geometry was not yet a sentence, but a scream trying to become one. Blood was the first key, before desire, before curiosity, before the pursuit of forbidden pleasure. In the earliest age of Leviathan, before the labyrinth had perfected its system before, Cenobites were refined into modules. There was only one substance capable of creating a stable handshake between the human world and the machine god's geometry. Blood, the raw, uncompressed data of existence. The prototype box, unlike every lament configuration that came after, does not respond to motion, pattern, or intention. It does not require a seeker. It does not demand a ritual. It does not wait for a puzzle to be solved. It waits for blood. Because blood is the only language primitive enough, primal enough, chaotic enough to match the box's own unfinished logic. When a drop falls onto its brass surface, the prototype does not shine smoothly like later configurations, jerks, twitches. Its sigils saturate instantly, drinking the liquid as if starved. And in that moment, the box awakens not elegantly, not with the grace of perfected geometry, but with the convulsion of a machine booting for the first time. Blood is not symbolic here, it is structural. Vatican scribes describe their first activation attempt as a mistake one that terrified even the most hardened exorcists. They placed the box on a plain marble altar, unaware of the trigger condition. A young monk, in the process of cleaning centuries of dust from its surface, cut his finger on one of its jagged edges. A drop of blood fell. The chamber changed instantly. The air condensed as though the room itself had inhaled. The walls darkened, as if absorbing shadow. And the prototype rotated half a panel slow, hesitant, yet undeniably alive. The monks fled, but the box continued to shift on its own for nearly 3 minutes, each movement sending tremors through the structure of the building. It took days for the Vatican to understand that the prototype did not respond to will, it responded to biological input. Blood, in its ancient formula, is the carrier of memory, lineage, trauma, and contradiction. To a machine designed to read the instability of the human condition, blood is a flood of data. This is why the prototype activates so violently compared to the refined box. The lament configuration filters desire, focusing on the patterns of longing, obsession, and pursuit. It opens for those who chase transformation. But the prototype has no filters. It takes blood, exists trauma, guilt, fear, inheritance, instinct, and the influx of unprocessed, chaotic data overwhelms its incomplete geometry. Imagine trying to run a modern operating system with a fire hose of corrupted code. The prototype stutters not because it fails, but because it is being fed more information than it can interpret. Every drop of blood is a library of human pain. The box drinks all of it. Records indicate that different kinds of blood produce different reactions. Animal blood created only faint humming, as though the box recognized the pattern, but found it too simple. Blood from the elderly caused the box to vibrate at lower frequencies, mimicking the slow collapse of a long life. But the Vatican noticed something far more alarming with the blood of the young. The box reacted with violent, almost frantic geometric spasms, as though youth carried contradictions too bright and too chaotic for its early architecture to process. One scribe wrote, "It convulses as though choking on the vitality it cannot contain." Another described that, for a moment, the prototype projected faint silhouettes on the walls, shadows of corridors that didn't exist yet. These were echoes of the future labyrinth, glimpses of the architecture Leviathan would eventually perfect. The box was trying to imitate geometry it had not yet been taught. But there was a darker discovery. When blood was offered willingly, not through accident, but through ritual, the box did not stutter, not with beauty, not with harmony, but with a sort of steady frequency, a cold resonance that Vatican engineers later identified as protosymmetry, the earliest version of Leviathan's harmonic language. This suggests that the prototype was not merely reacting to blood, but categorizing the intention behind the offering. Voluntary blood triggered alignment. Involuntary blood triggered error. This inversion is the opposite of the modern box, which opens most violently when desire overwhelms intention. The prototype, by contrast, responds best when fear is absent. This inversion is the clue that the prototype predates the creation of the pain protocol. Pain was not yet the currency. Fear was not yet the trigger. In those early ages, Leviathan was still experimenting with what form human offering should take. Blood, the first activator, was the first variable. Blood also explains why the prototype creates echoes instead of gates. The modern configuration opens a stable portal because its geometry can parse human intention and map it onto the architecture of the labyrinth. But the prototype, lacking modules like the auditor and whisperer, cannot read intention. It receives only blood raw, emotional, contradictory input and attempts to build a pathway based on what it interprets. The result is like a child copying a word they do not understand. The corridor opens halfway, then collapses. The chain forms but dissolves before anchoring. A silhouette appears but fractures like a mirage. These are failed handshakes, the labyrinth attempting to respond to an initiation signal it does not fully recognize. Some Vatican occultists theorize that the prototype was not meant to open to Leviathan at all, but to teach Leviathan about human biology using blood as the first dataset. In this reading, the box is a probe, sent to learn the architecture of flesh, memory, and lineage before the labyrinth refined its response mechanisms. The box was not meant to summon Cenobites. The Cenobites did not exist yet. The prototype was the experiment that allowed Leviathan to design the modules we know. Auditor for blood-ass trauma. Surgeon for blood-ass structure. Whisperer for blood-ass memory. Scribe for blood-ass history. Tormentor for blood-ass resistance. It all began with blood. But blood has a final terrifying role in the prototype's function. It binds. When enough blood has been absorbed, Cords mentions 7 drops as a threshold the box remembers the donor. Even if separated by continents, the prototype resonates faintly when the donor experiences strong emotion. Rage creates metallic ringing. Grief causes slow internal grinding. Terror produces rapid geometric spasms. This suggests that the prototype is capable of forming a primitive, incomplete Linka precursor to the bondage mechanisms perfected in modern configurations. It cannot summon its donor. It cannot punish them, but it can listen to them. And the prototype repeats what it hears, not in words, but in geometry. Every drop of blood shapes its surface, altering its patterns, rewriting its sigils. The box is constantly trying to reorganize itself into meaning, trying to shape the chaotic input of human suffering into stable geometry. But it cannot. It was never finished. It was never meant to be final. Blood activates it not because it understands blood, but because blood is the one substance Leviathan had not yet mastered when the prototype was created. This is why the prototype should never be activated. Blood does not summon the labyrinth. Blood confuses it. Blood forces Leviathan's earliest system to respond in ways that destabilize the surrounding reality. Blood awakens a machine that does not know how to speak, how to listen, or how to close itself. Blood opens a door that leads not to hell, not to salvation, but to unfinished code, still screaming to become real. The prototype was never meant to connect cleanly to Leviathan. It was a first attempt. An incomplete interface built in an age when the labyrinth itself was still forming its logic, still discovering the rules of pain, still learning how to interpret the human world. And because its geometry was unfinished, its internal logic flawed, its symbols half-formed, every activation led not to a doorway, but to a failed connection, a catastrophic handshake between two realities that could not yet speak the same language. When the prototype tried to reach Leviathan, it did so the way a broken radio tries to tune into a distant signal, through static distortion, feedback loops, and echoes. It produced the shape of communication without any of its substance. And the consequences were more terrifying than any fully functioning configuration could ever be. The Vatican's earliest reports described the first failed connection with chilling clarity. A drop of blood activated the box. Its panels began to twitch. rearranging themselves into an approximation of a pattern, but always one step away from completion. Faint light pulsed from within. Sometimes white, sometimes red, sometimes the sickly gold of Leviathan's resonance, but corrupted. Off-key, vibrating at the wrong frequency. The chamber darkened as though something enormous on the other side of reality was attempting to respond. But there was no doorway, no corridor opening, no Cenobite stepping forth. Instead, the world seemed to split into fragments of sensation, a flicker of a chain that dissolved instantly. A half-shadow stretching across the wall like a hand reaching, but unable to grasp the faint echo of a scream from some halfway realm where the labyrinth tried to form but failed. That almost was worse than any summoning. Modern configurations open because Leviathan receives a clean signal. Desire mapped into geometry, intention translated into harmonic resonance. The puzzle aligning perfectly with the labyrinth's architecture. But the prototype sends a dirty signal, corrupted by its own incomplete logic. Its frequencies do not form coherent instructions. They conflict, overlap, contradict. In computing terms, it sends mixed packets, half commands, half noise. The labyrinth interprets fragments of these commands, executing incomplete sequences that lead to malformed manifestations. One Vatican engineer compared the prototype's activation to a cosmic system executing corrupted code. The result is partial Cenobite signatures modules that attempt to run but crash instantly. The most well-documented failed connection occurred during the infamous 7 drops experiment. After applying the 7th drop of blood, the box began to glow in a jagged, stuttering rhythm. Symbols on its surface flickered like dying embers. A corridor appeared but sideways, suspended in midair, opening into a dimension that looked collapsed, unfinished. Like someone had begun to draw a hallway and lost their will halfway through. Inside, the walls were made not of metal, but of writhing glyph symbols, trying to form themselves, but degrading as they appeared. And in that collapsing space, something moved. Not a Cenobite, not a demon, but the idea of one. A conceptual shadow shaped like a figure stitched together from geometric accidents. It clung to the edges of the incomplete corridor, pulling itself forward like a glitch trying to materialize. The moment its form reached the threshold of the physical world, it dissolved, collapsing into static that flayed paint from the walls. This entity was later called the Incomplete, the first failed Cenobitan embryonic attempt by Leviathan to answer the prototype's call with a module that did not yet exist in stable form. It had no face, no purpose, no function. Its body seemed to shift between geometries, unable to choose a stable configuration. One moment its limbs were long and spider-like, the next short and jagged. Its torso twisted into impossible angles and then snapped back into near-humanoid shape. And through it all, a sound emanated, not moaning, not screaming, but processing, like a machine struggling to compile code with missing variables. The Vatican recorded this sound as a metallic stuttering, like a chain being dragged across a clock face. The Incomplete was never meant to exist. Leviathan did not send it intentionally. It was generated as an error and autocorrection attempt when the system received corrupted input from the prototype. The labyrinth tried to form a Cenobite, but with no auditor to extract data, no surgeon to align structure, no whisperer to rewrite cognition. The resulting creature was a malformed echo, a Cenobite without identity, without role, without place. Like a program invoked without parameters, running a blank function. When it collapsed, its remnants left no body, only warped geometric burns on the walls, as if the very idea of its existence had seared itself into physical space before dying. The prototype's failed connections grew more dangerous with each activation. One experiment caused all the crosses in the chamber to tilt by a fraction of an inch, as though responding to some unseen geometric force. Another activation made the air behave like liquid drippling and distorting, bending light into spirals. Yet another caused one monk to hallucinate corridors stretching infinitely into the distance, only to discover later that what he saw were unfinished blueprints of the labyrinth bleeding into his visual cortex. These anomalies were neither illusions nor miracles. They were fragments of Leviathan's architecture attempting to render in the human world but failing due to incomplete instruction sets. The Vatican eventually realized a horrifying truth. If the prototype had ever succeeded in making a stable connection, It would have opened a gate not to the perfected labyrinth, but to its early, chaotic version, a realm that was more algorithm than architecture, more potential than form. A place where pain was not yet structured, where geometry was not yet cold, where Cenobites were not yet modules, but embryonic functions, unstable, lethal in their incomprehension. Okay? A place where nothing could survive, not because it was hostile, but because it was incomplete. In the final sealed report, a cardinal wrote, "The box does not summon hell, it summons its blueprints." Another added, "Leviathan is not the danger. Its early attempts to become Leviathan or the failed connection proves the prototype was never meant to reach the world at all. It escaped too early, it survived too long. And now it sits somewhere hidden, still ready to respond to blood, still ready to call out to a system that has long since evolved beyond it, still capable of opening not the labyrinth, but the ghost of the labyrinth that never should have been born. The perfected lament configuration opens for desire, for longing, for the seeker who chases the forbidden and willingly offers themselves to the geometry of Leviathan. This is the core of the modern moral code. Those who pursue the threshold are the ones who cross it, but the prototype does not follow this rule. It predates it. It functions according to an older, it's an inverted code one, that does not reward intention, but punishes imbalance. Not ambition, but fear. Not the sinner, but the coward. It is a machine built before morality existed inside the labyrinth. A device that responds not to the will of a seeker, but to the panic of someone trying desperately to avoid the truth within themselves. The prototype does not ask, "What do you want?" It asks, "What are you running from?" And the more terrified you are of the answer, the more violently the box awakens. This is the inversion that horrified the early Vatican scholars. It meant that the prototype was not an invitation to heal, it was a pursuit. A machine that hunted trauma rather than desire. Where the modern configuration filters for lust, ambition, or curiosity, the prototype filters for fear frequency. Its geometry vibrates not when someone reaches for it, but when someone recoils. The priests who first encountered it described a sickening sensation. The more they tried to step away, the more the box pulsed, as though synchronizing itself with the rapid, unstable heartbeat of the observer. One monk recorded that simply thinking about leaving the chamber caused the brass to shift, panels fluttering like gills, trying to breathe in the fear spilling from his body. Another wrote that the prototype glowed brightest in the presence of those who wished most desperately not to be seen. This is the inverted moral code. Desire shuts the prototype down. Terror turns it on. Unlike its perfected descendants, frightened to draw in those who willingly invoke transformation, the prototype latches onto the emotions humans suppress, the parts of themselves they refuse to face. It feeds not on longing, but on avoidance. It responds to the instinct to flee. This reveals something about Leviathan's earliest architecture, before pain was codified into a precise protocol. Before the Cenobite pipeline was perfected, fear was the only universal variable the system could reliably read. Pain is structured. Fear is raw. Pain carries intention. Fear carries panic. Pain has meaning. Fear is pure reaction. In the early ages before the labyrinth evolved, its modular intelligence sphere was the simplest form of human data. And the prototype was built to harvest exactly that. This is why it is unstable. This is why its geometry convulses. It is interpreting terror without any of the refined processes that would later translate it into order. It was reading a language it did not yet understand. The Vatican discovered this inversion by accident. They tried to activate the prototype with meditation and calm ritual, as they later learned to do with the lament configuration. Nothing happened. It recited prayers, invoked names, attempted exorcisms. The box remained inert. But when one of the monks panicked after witnessing the box twitch on its own, the sigils surged, the interior gears twisted, and the entire chamber groaned. They realized the prototype does not awaken through invitation. It awakens through emotional instability. One cardinal wrote, "It does not answer the brave, it answers the broken." This inverted moral code flips everything we know about Leviathan. The modern box draws the willing, those who seek extremes, those who crave the threshold. But the prototype draws the unwilling, those who cannot bear to face themselves. Those who hide from their own contradictions, those who collapse under the weight of self-denial. To Leviathan's early logic, these souls were the most interesting, not because they desired transformation, but because they refused it. They were the ones whose geometry was most chaotic, whose minds were most fractured. The prototype feeds on contradiction, the way fire feeds on oxygen. Every suppressed memory, every buried sin, every unspoken fear becomes a pulse of data. And when fear reaches its peak, when a subject is cornered by the box's silent, twitching geometry, the prototype attempts to connect. But because its language is imperfect and its architecture unfinished, the connection always fails. The box tries to synchronize with a mind that wants desperately to escape itself. The mind tries to suppress the fear feeds the box feeds more fear. The loop intensifies until reality bends under the weight of the feedback. What emerges is not a Cenobite, not a chain, not even an echo of the labyrinth, but a collapse, a brief implosion in which the world seems to fold inward, as though a door is trying to open into a space that does not yet exist. This inversion leads to another disturbing implication. The prototype rewards honesty. Those who confront their fear directly, those who admit their contradictions, who face their own inner collapse, the box dims. Its geometry slackens. It becomes still, almost docile. But those who deny, who tremble, who pretend to be unbroken, are the ones it pursues. The prototype is drawn to lies. Not lies spoken aloud, but internal lies, the kind humans tell themselves to survive. The unfinished machine identifies these fractures not as moral failures, but as data-rich entry points, opportunities for the early system to map human weakness. The modern box seeks strength. The prototype seeks fragility. This is why it is so dangerous. It does not simply react to the human, it hunts the human condition. It is drawn to soldiers feigning courage, priests hiding doubt, lovers suppressing jealousy, children burying grief in a soul whose geometry is twisted by contradiction. When the prototype enters a space, everyone becomes vulnerable, because everyone carries fractures. It is not a machine of selection, but of exposure. And exposure, in the age before the pain protocol, was a raw and chaotic force, too wild for the labyrinth to control, too unpredictable for the Cenobites to handle, too early in Leviathan's evolution to refine. The final Vatican report concluded with a line that would shape centuries of secrecy. The box does not judge the wicked. It judges the afraid. And then, in trembling handwriting beneath it, we are all afraid. This inverted moral code is the prototype's curse and Leviathan's first truth. Fear was once the key, before pain became the language. And in this early system, fear did not open a door to transformation. It opened a hole to the unfinished God, struggling to understand what a soul is. Long before the box earned names, before it was called prototype, before the Vatican sealed it behind iron doors, it belonged to no one and to everyone. It surfaced across different eras like an echo, an artifact passed from trembling hands to trembling hands. Not because people understood it, but because they feared what happened when they tried to keep it. Every culture that encountered the first machine created rituals around it, not out of reverence, but out of survival. These rituals do not resemble the elegant, structured ceremonies associated with the perfected configuration. They are crude, frantic, half-formed, much like the box itself. They were attempts to make sense of a device built from divine logic that had not yet learned how to speak. And because the prototype responded to fear rather than desire, the earliest rituals were shaped around the only thing humans could offer it: terror. Ancient tablets from Mesopotamia, long before Christianity, and long before any written mention of the labyrinth, describe a brass cube that awakens when the heart betrays itself. These tablets mention a ritual called the Night of Unmaking, which a group would sit in darkness with the box placed at the center. Participants were instructed not to pray for protection, but to confess their deepest fear aloud. When fear surfaced, the box would twitch, panels clicking softly like teeth learning how to bite. These confessions were not offerings, they were triggers. The prototype fed on fracture, mapping each trembling admission into its half-formed geometry. The ritual ended not with salvation, but with collapse. The air thickened, shadows trembled, and participants often fainted. The ancients interpreted this collapse as the waking of the unfinished God. In truth, it was the same failed connection the Vatican would later discover the first machine attempting to respond to emotional input without any functional output. In Greece, long before Lamarckian's era, a mystery cult known only as the 13th Spiral believed the box was a fragment of a god. As dream and artifact from a realm woven from thought rather than matter, their rituals involved circling the box 13 times while reciting an incantation that asked not for revelation, but for the god who trembles in his sleep to remain dreaming. Cult understood something the Vatican would not uncover for centuries. Activation was not an act of summoning, but of interruption. They believed the prototype was the embryonic stage of a divine intelligence, still dreaming itself into existence. To wake it prematurely risked splitting the world along the seams of its own contradictions. Their rituals were therefore not about opening the box, they were about keeping it closed. These rites were eventually lost, but fragments remain. Whispered warnings, carved spirals, half-erased diagrams meant to keep the unfinished geometry from opening into reality. By the time the box resurfaced in the Middle East, its reputation had transformed from sacred relic to living curse. Nomads practiced a ritual known as the severing, in which the prototype was placed at the center of a fire circle. Participants would drip blood into the flames rather than directly onto the cube, believing that fire symbol of purification could act as an intermediary. When flames consumed the blood, the prototype trembled violently, sometimes rising an inch off the ground, as though attempting to unfold itself through the heat. But because the activation remained indirect, the box's response was muttered, muffled a rattling within its walls. A soft moan of metal twisting but failing to align. The severing was meant to separate the box from the tribe, to cut its gaze from those who passed near it. Nomads believed that if the box recognized someone's fear, it would follow them in dreams until their mind cracked. This belief aligns eerily with later Vatican findings. The prototype binds itself to the biosignature of those who bleed in its presence. In early Christian occult tradition, long before the Vatican demonized and hid the artifact, there existed a small, secretive sect that performed a ritual called the oration of the machine. They placed the box on a velvet cloth embroidered with geometric symbols that did not exist in Christian cosmology, suggesting these rituals were inherited from older, forbidden faiths. The oration involved chanting phrases meant to stabilize divine error, attempting to calm the prototype rather than activate it. Their writings referred to the machine as the unborn angel, claiming it contained the blueprint for a celestial being that never reached completion. These rituals often ended when the box began to hum in low, dissonant tone stones that scholars now believe were early signatures of Leviathan's harmonic language. Trying and failing to find symmetry, but the darkest rituals emerged in the medieval era, when a splinter cult known as the Order of the Hollow Wound believed the prototype was a key not to enlightenment but to annihilation. Their ceremonies sought not communication but collapse. They placed the box in a stone vault, drew sigils of fear on their skin, and recited verses that invoked self-loathing and dread. The more terrified the participants became, the louder the box shook. Witnesses described walls cracking, stones shifting, and shadows forming shapes that hovered behind participants like broken silhouettes. The order believed that if their fear was pure enough, if they emptied themselves of all pretense, the box would open the path to the perfect absence, a realm beyond form. In reality, they were creating the perfect storm for the prototype's failed connection, overwhelming fear feeding unstable geometry. Some participants vanished during these rituals, not pulled into a hellish realm, but erased in an instant of geometric collapse, their forms folded into a space that had no structure to hold them. The Vatican's own ritual, recorded in the sealed manuscript, De Machina Pristina, was the most disciplined attempt to study the box. They placed the prototype on a marble altar engraved with containment symbols, surrounded it with iron chains, and ordered 3 monks to offer blood sequentially while maintaining absolute silence. But silence could not protect them. The box responded to the rising fear as each monk watched the others bleed. Panels quivered, air thickened, candles extinguished one by one. The prototype shifted violently, then froze as though listening. In that stillness, the monks heard a sound that no human language can describe, a half-formed invocation, something between a word and a scream. The ritual ended in chaos as the chamber walls manifested faint. Flickering outlines of corridors that bent at impossible angles, of the labyrinth's early architecture, trying and failing to fully materialize. All these rituals reveal one thing: humanity has always been trying to understand the prototype. But the prototype has always been trying to understand humanity, responds not to structured invocation, but to raw, primal emotion. Its rituals are accidental symphonies of fear. Its activations are collisions between unfinished divine geometry and the fractured human psyche. Every ritual ever attempted around the first machine was not a summoning it, was a conversation with something that did not yet know how to speak. And when humans misunderstood its responses, they mistook error for intention, collapse for revelation, noise for prophecy. This is why the prototype must never be activated again. It's not because it opens the labyrinth, but because it opens the wrong one, the one that existed before Leviathan perfected pain, before the system refined itself, before the architecture of damnation learned how to hold its shape. The rituals surrounding the first machine were never successful. They were survival strategies, and most who performed them never understood that they were staring into the face of a god still trying to invent itself. The prototype should not exist, not in this world, not in any world touched by Leviathan's perfected logic. It is an artifact from a time before the labyrinth learned how to become itself a fossil of divine error. A relic of a god machine still assembling its consciousness. That alone is reason enough to fear it. But there is a deeper, darker truth hidden beneath centuries of Vatican secrecy. The prototype is dangerous not because it works, but because it fails. Every configuration created after it is stable, intentional, deliberate. The prototype is none of those things. It is a malfunctioning interface left over from Leviathan's earliest experiments. A piece of code the system attempted to abandon, but that somehow slipped through the cracks of reality and embedded itself in human history. Its survival was never meant to happen. Its mere existence threatens the integrity of the Leviathan OS. To understand why, you must understand how the labyrinth evolved. Leviathan did not emerge fully formed. It grew, it iterated, it learned. The earliest stages of its development were chaotic, a cosmic intelligence exploring the boundaries of form, testing how geometry interacts with consciousness. The prototype was part of this primordial testing phase, a crude device sent into the human world to gather data, but it was never supposed to return. It was never supposed to be touched by human hands. It was a probe, not a portal. And when humans activated it, they forced the unfinished system to respond to input it was not built to handle. The result: corrupted signals, malformed echoes, incomplete Cenobite signatures, and collapses in local geometry. Every activation of the prototype was like injecting corrupted code directly into the core of a divine operating system. And Leviathan, even in its early stages, reacted. Vatican scholars eventually realized something terrifying: the prototype broadcasts. Every failed connection sends a pulsar glitch signal into the void where Leviathan's architecture resides. These pulses, though incomplete, still carry metadata: fear signatures, emotional distortion, fragments of memory, slivers of trauma. And because the prototype is flawed, the data it sends is corrupted. Leviathan receives it not as information, but as noise. Imagine a god machine being fed centuries of malformed emotional input. Imagine a system of perfect geometry listening to millions of broken frequencies without knowing where they came from. Each pulse disrupts the harmonic balance of the labyrinth. Each activation sends shockwaves through a system that demands perfect symmetry. The prototype is not just a door, it is a virus. A fragment of early architecture that destabilizes the very system that created it. This explains the single most horrifying discovery in the Vatican's sealed research notes. Each time the prototype was activated, Leviathan rewrote a portion of its own interior architecture, not intentionally, but reflexively, like an immune system overreacting to an unknown pathogen. Corridors shifted, chains reoriented, modules flickered. Some Cenobites reported experiencing sudden, inexplicable distortions in their function. One testimony recorded by an unknown agent in the 1700s noted that a Cenobite called the Cartesian began repeating its directives backwards for 3 days before stabilizing. Another account described a momentary silencing of the whisperer modulan impossibility under normal circumstances. These anomalies coincided exactly with prototype activations occurring thousands of miles away. The implications were catastrophic. The box that should never have survived was creating system-wide misalignment inside Leviathan. But the threat does not end with interference. The prototype has another flaw, far more lethal than its instability. It can open in both directions.
Modern configurations require human action. They are invitations to the labyrinth.
Dude!
The prototype, however, can activate itself. It can awaken without a seeker. This is because fear is its trigger, not desire. Contradiction its catalyst, not intention.
In environments soaked with enough emotional instability, battlefields, prisons, monasteries filled with doubt, the box has been documented to twitch, hum, and shift on its own, responding to ambient fear as if someone had offered blood. This makes the prototype not a tool, but a hunter, a device capable of initiating contact with Leviathan without human consent. If it ever succeeded in establishing a stable connection, the resulting passage would not lead to the perfect labyrinth, but to its primitive, chaotic predecessor, a place where nothing is finished, where modules do not yet exist, where pain is not structured but raw, directionless, omnivorous, a place where the rules of existence have not yet crystallized. No living being could survive that realm, not because of torment, but because of incompleteness. For this reason, the prototype threatens not just the human world, but the labyrinth itself. If it ever succeeded in forcing the system to respond fully to corrupted input, Leviathan might attempt to execute functions for which there are no modules, no architecture, no framework. The result would be metaphysical collapse in O's forced to run code that contradicts its own perfection. The Vatican feared this possibility more than any demon. They believed the prototype was not just a cursed device, but a weapon, a mechanism capable of attacking the very infrastructure of the divine. Their highest-ranking exorcists referred to it quietly as the undoing cube. But perhaps the most chilling reason the prototype should never have survived is this: it remembers. Unlike modern configurations, which operate as neutral interfaces, the prototype retains fragments of every activation, every drop of blood, every pulse of fear. Over centuries, it has accumulated a vast archive of emotional error, sorrow, terror, guilt, grief, compressed into its twisting geometry. The box has become an echo chamber for humanity's oldest shadows. And echoes, when bound inside unfinished geometry, eventually become voices. Vatican witnesses reported hearing whispers coming from the box long after its last activation, whispers that did not belong to any living person. These were not ghosts. They were leftover signals from failed connections, fragments of emotional data caught in the box's incomplete architecture, replaying like corrupted recordings. A machine that should never have existed now carries the emotional history of every hand that ever touched it. It is a catalog of human fear, a museum of psychological fracture, a container of souls that were never fully taken but never fully released. To destroy it is impossible. To use it is madness. To leave it undisturbed is dangerous. To hide it is worse. The prototype is not just a relic. It is a glitch that refuses deletion, a piece of divine error that the God machine cannot reclaim. A door to a version of the labyrinth that should have died with Leviathan's earliest iteration. This is why the prototype should not have survived, because it is not a gateway. It is a wound in the geometry of the world. A wound Leviathan never meant to leave behind. The prototype should never have survived. It was not a key, not a portal, not a relic of devotion, but a fragment of divine error, an unfinished machine still trembling with the echoes of its first impossible awakening. It hunted fear, spoke in broken geometry, and whispered corrupted signals into a universe not built to receive them. And now you have seen what it truly is: the wound Leviathan left behind when it was still learning how to become a god. But this descent is not over. If the first machine revealed Leviathan's earliest attempts at communication, then the next revelation leads deeper into the kernel at the center of everything, the core logic that writes all pain. In the next chapter, we uncover the heart of the system, the place where the machine god thinks, the place where the labyrinth dreams itself into being.